We are starting soon. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the third session of City Regions webinar series. My name is Lalit Kishore Bhati. I'm an architect, urban planner in Auroville. And I'm a joint organizer along with Dr. Christoph from Indo-German Center for Sustainability, IGCS, which is located in IIT Madras, IIT Chennai. So today is the third session, and we have Dr. Joe from Manchester, as well as three speakers from IIT Chennai on Peri-cene project. And I would now hand over to Dr. Christoph to moderate the session for today. And towards the end, we will be sharing the information about the next and the last session of the series. Also, the general format is that so the speakers will be sharing their presentation, and there will be a possibility of a short 2-3 questions depending upon the duration of the answers. So we want to have a quick clarification level questions after the presentation, and approximately 20 minutes plus minus time towards the end for larger question answer possibility. This is the way it is, and all questions are requested to be presented via the chat box. This is also being live streamed at YouTube and Facebook. The people, those who are listening and watching, they are also requested to post their question there, which will be copied and brought it here. Thank you very much for joining and for your interest. Now I hand over to Dr. Christoph. Christoph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lalit. Good evening, good afternoon to you all, wherever you are, and very warm welcome to our third session in the webinar, which has the title, The Synergistics of the Peri-urban, Chennai and Manchester in the Peri-cene. And this is a collaborative project that is carried out by the IGCS, the Indo-German Center for Sustainability, together with the University of Manchester, and also partners in Stockholm. This program has been going on for a while now, the research project, and we have several speakers that will engage today also with the audience. We have an interactive session today where we will ask you specific questions and use this also as a kind of engagement tool. What we are planning to do is to integrate these questions in the presentations. So we will have this interactive tool as one method, and then after each presentation, we will also have immediate question and answer opportunity, and we will have a final discussion over 20 minutes. This session, I'm very happy to have the principal investigator, Dr. Joe Ravitz, with us. He is with the University of Manchester, and he has over many years developed an approach to urban and regional development, which he labels from smart to wise, which engages in collaborative planning and futures planning and identifying ways to develop scenarios for the future. And this is a framework that he will present here today and also apply to the Manchester case study. And then we have a number of colleagues from the Indo-German Center. Professor Sudhir Chellarajan will give us an overview of the activities that the IGCS has carried out since back 2013 in studying the peri-urban space, peri-urban regions, with a focus on Chennai. And then my colleague, Utra Radhakrishnan, she is a senior project officer with the IGCS, and in this project, she will give us an overview of various aspects of this project related to land use and water management and the analysis of the urban region. And finally, Dr. Avilash Raul, who is a principal researcher with the Peri-cene and also a guest professor with the humanities department at IIT Madras. He will give us an overview of some of the issues that we are looking into in terms of governance and the future of governance. Before we go into these presentations, I would like to give you a brief overview of IGCS and the background of the IGCS and its activities. I hope that this is visible to you, the slides that I'm sharing here. The IGCS is a center which is a bilateral government collaboration between the Indian and German governments, and it is located physically on the IIT Madras campus, as you can see here. The funding comes from both the governments, so it's shared funding, and a number of universities and research institutions are involved in the center's activities. From the German side, the German Academic Exchange Service is a prominent supporter, especially to facilitate the mobility of researchers. I'm trying to move on to the next slide. So the center was founded in 2010, and this year we celebrated the 10th anniversary. This was a big celebration because there were also a lot of uncertainties about the future of the center and how to reorganize it. It's also still, from the German side, a project that is being funded. So we are in the process of consolidating the center in India and with the activities in Germany. The focus activities are 4 core areas, and this is to be seen as an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach relating to core human activities and how these human activities can play out, the pathways that can be developed for the future. So I'm attached to the land use and urban and regional development area, and then there are waste management, energy, water quality, and water availability as areas in the center. And the organization is in fact quite interesting because it is really an attempt to create a center in both the countries. While it is located at IIT Madras with 4 professors who represent as area coordinators these 4 areas, there are professors in Germany at various universities. I'm attached to the RWTH Aachen as well. And there is a professor in geography who represents land use and urban regional development, the TU Berlin, the energy sector, Kiel University, water and hydro geology, and Stuttgart University represents waste and sewage management. And then we have a number of other people involved in this. So the center is actually an open structure where other professors also can be part of in terms of research and also the exchange or mobility of researchers. So this here just gives you an idea of the outreach and the core activities. One core activity is the mobility and the exchange of researchers and students at all levels of their career. So we facilitate and promote collaborative research through scholarships and the so-called IGCS fellows. And you can see that, in fact, over these 10 years, the number has been steadily rising. Where you see a dip, this is where the project phase had ended and we had been waiting for the next funds for the next phase. But overall, there has been quite a large number of researchers visiting each other's countries. At the moment, there is one interdisciplinary flagship project that is being funded by the Department for Science and Technology, Government of India, on climate change impacts on coastal infrastructure and related adaptation strategies, which is taking Chennai and the Chennai coastal region as a focus case study area. And in terms of the exchange programs and the learning and teaching program, the summer and winter schools, which are taking place annually, have been carried out since 2012 with more than 500 participants so far. So our alumni group is also steadily growing. And the next summer school is going to be a virtual summer school in the first 2 weeks of October now, on the topic of smart mobility and smart city development. So with this, I'm already concluding now, and please have a look at the homepage and follow us on Facebook for any news and other updates. The offer and the opportunity is, of course, there to join us through a fellowship and become part of the IGCS. Now, I would like to pass on to Dr. Joe Ravets to start with his presentation on the synergistics and the Manchester case study. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Christoph. Very, very pleased to be here, and thanks to Lalit Tatoraville for organising, co-hosting, etc. I guess it's quite an international meeting. This is always a good thing from my point of view. I'm phoning in from Manchester. The weather is a bit cool, but you know, we survive somehow. So I would like to present to you today probably too much information, but hopefully some insights, and also to have some fun. This is always good for the learning experience and the debate and so on. And also to introduce quite a simple but effective kind of participation questions. You'll notice on the slide here, sorry, I forgot to share it. You see the slide, the front page here now, okay. So on the top right-hand side, a little website, menti.com, with a passcode. And anyone who has a smartphone, that's probably everybody in the audience, or a laptop even, while you are on this call, visit the site, type in the passcode, and then as soon as I put up a presentation, then it should appear on your smartphone. And I think if you go there now, you will find, yeah, the first question, which is coming up, which is who in the audience lives where? And this is just like a kind of, you know, straw poll to kind of, you know, locate ourselves and get us started. So I'm just actually myself putting in this code 806 and just to check. Yeah, okay. So, and actually, in the spirit of the modern emerging city, you can live in more than one place at once. This is, you know, multi-locality, etc. Anyway, so as we go through, we can put up the questions and examine the results bit by bit as we go through the presentation. And I hope this will make it more fun, more interactive. At the end, then we will have a review. Obviously, a lot of information will be there. We then press some kind of digital button and a full report in PDF form comes through. And this will be distributed to everybody for further study and debate. And just to say, okay, we can see this stuff actually coming through now. If I just go to this little gizmo, this is the kind of stuff which comes through. So as you put in your information, it comes through in real time, as if, you know, it's near magic, obviously. So this is not, you know, totally scientific. Obviously, the audience is not a random sample, but, you know, we do our best. And this is, I think, helpful to locate, you know, where are we? Where are we coming from? And so on. So we'll revisit these questions as we go through. So back to the presentation here. We make sure, sorry, that the only tricky bit here is making sure one is sharing the right screen at the right time. And, you know, you just have to pay attention, that should be okay. Wait a minute. Sometimes everything gets in a muddle. And sorry, bear with me. Okay, Christoph, can you see my front screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet coming up.
Okay, so wait a minute. Big apologies. Okay, here we go. You find your way around these things bit by bit. Anyway.
Yes.
Yes, are we online? Okay. So I have some contents. I'll introduce the synergistic thinking and the global peri-urban project. We'll talk about, and this comes in four main parts: the urban dynamics, the climate dynamics, the social dynamics, and the government dynamics. What could be simpler? And then we say, what next? And there's a bit of a story there about this little thing called COVID-19, which is a spanner in the works. Not to get sidetracked too much, but it can't be completely avoided. The objectives of all this are to be happy, as you can see on this street. These are my friends in Manchester, and these are my other friends somewhere in Chennai, actually. So with that said, and here's the link for the participation in case anyone missed it. Where is this coming from? Well, I wrote a book 20 years ago called City Region 2020. Seemed quite useful, but large questions still were to be answered. So this current book, just out actually, is a kind of follow-up, and it tries to really explore under the surface to say, okay, not only about the things of land use and industry and transport and so on, it's about how people think, how they communicate and learn. So this is the brief introduction to the synergistic thinking. First with the question, well, we've seen this one already, and just a little kind of poll on the, what do people understand by this peri-urban thing? And if you refresh your screen on your mobile, you should get a new question. Yes, it says the presenter has changed the slide. Go to the slide. And here you can enter in any text you like, hopefully short, to say, yeah, what is this peri-urban thing? How do you see it? Is it a problem? Is it an opportunity? Is it, you know, massive change, all mixed up? All these questions are to be revealed. So that's a free text and word cloud when it comes out. Moving on with this stuff here. Well, a couple of cartoons to set the scene. What did the future ever do for us? Well, this was 2015 in Manchester. Here is the Minister for Finance visiting, and he really wants to take down the town hall because it's so inefficient, can't be possibly effective or efficient or profit-making, and so on. And who has time to think about the future in this case? Another view is basically to say, what is the agenda here? And of course, major organizations, the EU, where I've done a lot of work, the World Bank, does this, Plan, Connect, Finance. And of course, the future is not only a matter for policymakers. Many people say, oh, actually, the writers, the filmmakers, they got a more accurate picture of the future city than any policymaker or even planner. So this also is kind of interesting to note. And then what you see is not always what you get. And if we talk about urban policy, well, this is rather strongly connected to transport policy. And this is rather strongly connected to energy and to foreign policy and so on. So this is then the totality of the picture. And as you see, there's some bad stuff going on in the Gulf region here, unfortunately, in which, you know, the powers of the world are always entangled. So this, for me, represents a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because we're trying to study a city, and that's pretty large and complex. If we have to study the whole world at the same time, it's impossible. The opportunity is, well, maybe the problems of the city can be found in other parts of the mix. So I'll come back to that. And then to introduce the central concept in synergistic thinking. Well, we can look at how people learn and think and communicate and collaborate in a very functional way. And this might be a very clever city, full of machinery. Everything works, there's robots and so on that take you where you want to go. And then we look at the effects on the politics, the economics, the ecology, and we can solve technical problems, but it's very difficult to do anything else. So we get a lot of local waste and depletion. We have industry which takes, makes, and dumps. We are likely to have a political system which is something like a dictatorship of the elite. So what could be an alternative? As most of our problems are complex, but most policy and technology is simple, monofunctional. So then we say, okay, what about a smart city? And as you know, there's a lot of talk about smart cities. I myself have done some work in India on smart cities. And here the thinking patterns are more complex. They're more self-organizing. They also tend to be fragile, myopic, short-term. And we then see a kind of picture of society. It's a kind of managed democracy. You can vote in elections, but somehow the elite still floats to the top. This is, you know, what we find. The waste and pollution is now kind of displaced to a global level. And business is the center of the picture, but most business, no matter how clever, how enterprising, is profit seeking. And that's a problem. So then we look for something like a wiser city with thinking patterns, with deeper complexity, many levels, self-organizing, neuroplastic, creative and strategic. And we can start to imagine what kind of society, what kind of government comes out of these new thinking patterns, and then to start looking for the pathways to get from smart to wise. Now, for myself, you know, having worked on this, I'm kind of on the inside of this bubble. All the time I need feedback, advice, critique, and so on. And I'm hoping that some people here might provide some of that, even in this digital sense. Then we track to that three-part scheme to different parts of the mix. So here's the cities in a linear functional sense, evolutionary sense, with big skyscrapers and big slum settlements, and then a co-evolutionary sense. Things are linked, multi-scale, multi-use, human scale, and so on. We can do similar things for the economy, and similar things for the ecology, and for the technology itself, the smart or whatever it is, and for the political system, the biggest question of all. So these are the kind of key diagrams, which, and a few of these I will elaborate in the next few minutes. as far as this is possible. So the central idea of that is not only to say, oh, here is a template, you know, do it like this and everything will be fine. Life is much more complex and much more interesting, usually. So we start talking about a process of first exploring the problems and priorities. How does this thing work? What is our problem? What's, you know, where do we draw the line between the city and the world? These things are never simple. Then we look at the implications, we analyze, we look at maps and trends and explore the alternatives. Also, we include visual thinking. You've probably gathered already, this is my favorite theme. I have a shed full of flip charts here, if anyone visits sometime. And we also include for specialist knowledge, the researchers, etc. And then the most important thing, the co-creation. We look for the synergies between the actors around the table. We look for value chains where everybody seems to gain just by collaboration. And then finally, we turn these into strategy and action, our practical plans, policies, actions, and so on. We may go around that cycle again, or we may say, okay, that's fine for now. In the meantime, practical questions come up, like, you know, when is lunch? Do people have to pay for this, or do we pay them? These are quite practical questions. And more significant, what kind of problem are we trying to solve? Is it a technical problem of the clever city? Or is it like a entrepreneurial problem of competition and innovation? Or is it a mode 3 type problem of transformation? These things really matter when you get to the crunch. So, well, that's a brief overview. For the full version, well, that would take some hours, but you know, that will do for now. I'd like to mention now the global climate change, peri-urban climate change project known as Peri-cene. You've probably heard of the Anthropocene. This is where humanity changes the surface of the planet to such a degree that it is then really a different planet. It's a new geological era. Our contention is we are not only in the Anthropocene, we're in a kind of Peri-cene. Peri-urban development is ruling the world. A lot of people overlook it. So say, oh, well, here's the cities and there's the rural areas. You know, what's the problem? From what we can see, yeah, the peri-urban is all around. Here's a nice little photograph, I think, from Christopher's collection, not far from where you are, I think, with a good example. And you see, oh, the water is full of rubbish and plastic and God knows what, and half the construction is unfinished. The place is a kind of, you know, work in progress, let's say. Anyway, just a moment for a couple of questions. And we asked people who lives where. We'd also like to ask people who works and plays where. And I'm just switching at this minute to the next slide. I think you have to adjust again your mobile to, presenter has changed the slide. So you go to the new one and you get a set of choices. Sorry, I forgot to include other. I should have put in airport lounges and hotels, because some people spend most of their time in these things when we're not all locked down. You get the idea. We'll look at these results like in a few minutes. So here's the question. Oh yes, and you can have 2 locations. That just shows how modern and mobile we all are. There is another question. When you've, let's say, I'll wait and see if more results come in on this work and play one. I put in work and play simply because not everyone works all the time. Some people play for very good reasons. And in a minute, let's say, we'll have a look at, the other question, which looks like this, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Just a word about the Peri-cene project. Well, we look at peri-urban climate change, we look at vulnerability, we look at collaborative governance. This goes around in some kind of loop. And the stakes are pretty big. Billions of people, trillions of assets. If we get it wrong, yeah, that's yet another thing on the global score chart, and so on. Our research questions are apparently quite simple. What are the effects of peri-urban on climate? What are the effects of climate on peri-urban? And then thirdly, how to do it all better? A $1 trillion question. And who wants to know about this? Well, urban, rural, environment planners, finance, real estate, social and community people, resource management, infrastructure, and so on. We have 21 partners in total. We have in-depth case studies in India and UK. And oh yes, and here's a global map of partners, which you can see on the website and click here and this kind of thing. So that's a very brief overview. Then we say, okay, how does it really work? And okay, so we've got 4 main boxes: spatial change, urban change, climate, vulnerability of social society, and governance. And then for each of these, we have some responses, climate responses, social responses, urban planning, and so on. And then we say, okay, wait a minute. This isn't okay for things that we can identify and measure and talk about, the causal framework, so-called. And what about other things which are not easily measured and talked about? And one example, and here we need to expand the drawing a bit. This is where the synergistic idea comes in. We're not just talking about stuff we can get a bit of data and measure it and that's the answer. We're talking about complex things in process. My favorite example is a village outside of Chennai called Kachipedu. It's all messed up. It's a long story. And the young people, they get into gangs and drugs and you know, digital stuff. And it's really kind of, you know, negative. And in the meantime, the ecosystems of the village are falling to bits for a number of powerful reasons. So a researcher from IGCS spent a lot of time there and somehow managed to mobilize the youth to stop doing gangs and drugs and fighting and to get into restoration of the ecosystems in that place, which is then good for food, for jobs, for the self-identity of the whole place, and so on. So that's a fantastic example of a synergistic type of response. Very difficult to measure. You can't see it from space, but it's really, really important. So, and again, then we have some kind of process model, in this case with 4 stages, to get around, to explore the different dimensions of this thing. So this is how the Pericene project is trying to work. Actually, it's not easy, but you know, that's what we're here for. I'll just, if I may, zoom back to the next question on here. What are your top priorities for discussion today? And some answers in there already. Sorry if I skipped around a bit, but we're getting there. And so if anyone wants to say, okay, this is my priority for discussion, we will try to track this. There is also the chat feed in the Zoom platform for questions that can be asked. This is a more, how do we say, more visual way of doing it, where you can see a number of things all at the same time. And again, this will be, you know, printed out on a PDF and sent to everybody at the end, or after the end. So if you have any great thoughts, top priorities for today, that would be really appreciated. And we'll try and visit them later on. So just back to where we were. Well, one of the things which is really useful in this kind of work is the scenario work. Here's some that we made earlier in a European project on the peri-urban called Plurel. It's another long story, which I can talk about another time. But you can see, oh, we were trying to envisage different kinds of futures for this peri-urban thing. Either it could be very globalized and top down, or it might be very, you know, grassroots and bottom up, so to say. It might be, on the one hand, public and community values, on the other hand, private enterprise. So then you can track this round the corners and say, oh, actually, large parts of the world are really kind of globalized and private enterprise focused. So, you know, the classic North American suburb, you know, large houses, large cars, money is no problem, carbon, CO2 is no problem. This reaches its end results in places like California, where the very, very richest of the rich, they now get private fire protection from specialist companies who will fly out there with helicopters and so on, just to protect, you know, the billionaire's house and property. And of course, there are other versions around the place. The UK, for example, is more like on the bottom right at the moment. You know, our government wants to shrink and let the private sector run things. We get flooding, but that's just tough. Usually it's the poor people who get flooded, so they don't worry too much, and so on. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's kind of the general picture. So that's the scenario viewpoint. Then, sorry for the somewhat tangled view of this diagram. This is like live action work from our area in Manchester, where we're using the same techniques. And again, for talking to stakeholders, we find, yeah, if you can draw something, you're halfway there. So as you can see, this drawing here is very rough, very quick. There's a way of doing this, you know, you can do this drawing literally in about 5 minutes max. And then say, okay, so what is our problem? Whose problem? Why is this a problem? What could be done? And so on and so on. And again, then we find, oh, we can use the scenario approach, both for what might happen, and then policy scenarios for what could we do. And in this case, it's an open question. We have this, in the UK, we have this little inconvenient fact called Brexit. You might have heard of it. It's a real spanner in the works. It's a, oh no, don't get me started. That would be another hour's presentation. But it does open up the book. So, oh, what could we do? Well, actually, nobody knows. The Minister of Environment doesn't really have a clear idea, and so on and so on. So again, we have to then, you know, open this up. So that's one example. And then we get to our little case study, and this is one of them. I say, oh, we've got all these wonderful aspirations: economy, society, social, governments, infrastructure, and they really all fit, they want to fit together. Can this be done? And this is actually not just a cartoon, it's a real place, which looks like this. And, you know, fantastic resources, but also huge problems. And by the way, it's a flood high risk zone, which, you know, is another spanner in the works, and so on and so on. So again, we have to ask some tricky questions just about, you know, what are the forces here? How do they fit together? So section 3, urban dynamics. Well, first of all, okay, let's get a handle on this problem. And here's another flip chart which got quite famous about 10 years ago, actually. People said, this is not a scientific result. And I said, well, this is what the stakeholders are talking about. So that, in my view, that is kind of a scientific result. So, you know, this is the conundrum of research. I'm sure many of you here have a similar thing. What's the problem? Well, okay, we can see this. For a global view, say, okay, this is the global, this is the urban world, 2010, actually, a bit out of date. And you can see, you know, the big urban centers are really no longer in Europe, India, China, Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on. And then we say, we scroll this forward to 2050, and these are simply the projections. This population is the most reliable of any kind of projection. So these are the urban numbers projected. Now, of course, we have to say, well, what do you mean by urban? Do you include, you know, the peri-urban, the scattered developments, the satellite towns, airport strips, you know, what is urban? So all these questions are still to be resolved, but I think it's a fascinating kind of comparison from, well, yesterday to 30 years in the future now. And we say, okay, this is the urban world, it's all over here. So bearing that in mind, well, we had some textbook stuff from our European project, and then we had more like a reality check. and you can see the difference between the textbook and the reality. And of course, if you zoom into that reality, it's infinitely complex. Then we can go a long way into working out the relation. Sorry.
Mobile alarm charges are what time?
So I didn't catch that.
Go ahead. I'm
Okay.
muted.
Yeah, relationships, links, connections, interchange, exchange, investment, flows of people or of resources. Now, again, this is a long story, but this is how we start to understand what is going on in this peri-urban thing. It's a space of relationships and flows. And it changes very rapidly, particularly in the developing world. And then, well, this is a page from my book, actually. I was trying to understand the system which leads on the left-hand side to what we can call urban sprawl. And you can see it's a pretty bad picture, you know. Everything is disconnected. The city is hollowed out. It's full of parking spaces and empty houses. Squatters have to live underneath the flyover. The water systems are all concreted over. The famous geographer Gertrude Stein said, you know what, there's no there. And this was her summary of, you know, what the urban sprawl was all about. So in the cartoon version, well, we look for ways to turn this around. In particular, if migrant workers are welcome as guests, maybe we can, you know, help them make a life. We restore the ecosystems. Maybe there's some connection there. And each part of the city region up above has some purpose, some connection. People talk about sprawl repair. I think my experience of India, for one, says, yeah, sprawl repair is going to be a pretty big business in the years to come. Now that we can stand back and say, oh my God, this is, you know, not how it was supposed to be, but here we are. Let's see if we can regenerate, recirculate and repair. And then we get a little bit more analytical and say, okay, this is a kind of systems view of the anti-city where things do not add up. It's not a system. Things do not, you know, there's no cohesion. And this is seen in the economic metabolism and the social metabolism. And the result is, yeah, we get real estate, which makes a lot of money, trashes the place, has no connection. Transport is impossible because the roads are not keeping up. There's no public transport, and so on and so on. So again, we say, okay, I wonder if there are different ways to do this, where we look for the synergies between the different types of actors, between construction, between real estate, infrastructure, ecology, and so on and so on. And then that tracks into land use. And we say, okay, here on the left, there's the anti-city, everything is disconnected, sprawling all over the place, pollution can grow and grow, it's nobody's problem, we waste land. Here on the right is what we call a spatial synergy. Things are connected, things are multifunctional. There are local centers where you can get what you need, and so on. And then we look for the pathways, and these are organized in a, you know, a simple politics, economics, social, ecology, technology, culture, and so on and so on. So that's a very brief overview of one way to start thinking about the sprawl repair project. And then if we get to climate dynamics, we'll have some more questions in a minute, I think. Well, I think the Chennai people are going to talk in more detail about the climate. So I'll just kind of put up, you know, this is the UK version, as you can see, bit of a problem. This is the global version, as you can see, quite a big problem. We're at the moment heading for the right-hand side of this picture of doom and catastrophe globally. A lot depends on the American election in about 6 weeks' time. And on the other hand, we can look for benefits and costs of investments in adaptation. And guess what? The net benefits of doing strengthening the early warning, resilience of infrastructure, dryland agriculture, mangroves, etc., the net benefits is $7 trillion. Well, that should be enough to make anyone sit up. There's only one small catch. It's spread all over the place. And in projects which are exceedingly complex with so many stakeholders, how do you bring all these together? So this is the question which we set ourselves. First, to understand the carbon flows through an average city and its peri-urban and its region. And the first thing you find is, oh, there's no proper right place to draw the line. You can draw it here, not in the right place. You can draw it there, not in the right place. You can draw it there. That's not in the right place either. In terms of connecting the carbon to government, to markets, to finance, to technology, and so on and so on. It's more complex. So this is, again, a reality check. This is where we're at. And then we say, okay, how about if we look at the adaptation process? Well, I'm sorry if this is, a problem to anybody here, but we have a lot of people in our country saying climate refugees go home. It's not our problem. Sorry, no offense, but don't come here. We will lock the gates and send you back. And this is happening in the Mediterranean, starting to happen in the UK. It's not good. So we say, okay, if we analyze what is going on here, well, we have a kind of single loop learning process from policy and business and so on. How does this work? Well, people say, oh, what is our problem? The sea is rising. Okay, we will build a wall, or we'll have a better, drain system. So, all right, but, what about the people? Oh, that's not in our problem. We are engineers, No offense to engineers, but, we need more. So the alternative, again, we look for the synergies. And in particular, this starts and ends with the people. And here you can see, and this is what my friends in the NGOs are trying to say to the UK and others, climate refugees are welcome. We are all in this together. Many people say, yeah, that's a great idea, but how do we do this? Where will they go? Okay, so then we have to say, yeah, what are we adapting to? Is it just some simple technical problem, or is it a bigger transformation of society? Who decides? Who adapts? How do we do this? And so on and so on. So we need different kinds of learning in the policy cycle. And then we get a different pattern of relationships around the table. And this is the kind of central method of the synergistic thing. We get people around the table. On this side, oh, it's full of power structures and conflicts and lost in translation. People are out of the loop, particularly residents and the low-income people. On the right-hand side, again, we look for the synergies, things that can work for a number of different types of people, and particularly the residents, the citizens. We get them into the loop. And then we look for the pathways which can make that work over a period of time. It is almost never a case of saying, oh, here's our policy that is, solved. More like to say, this is a way of working. It has to work over time to bring people together. So a couple of questions. How much does your organization know about climate change? I'll just change this question on the score sheet. So if you revisit your phone, this is a pretty simple question. We tried this with construction people in Pakistan, actually, of all places. Very interesting. Anyway, that's another story. And in a moment, let's say, if we just run that for a quick moment, I'll finish within 10 minutes. Is that okay, everybody? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, just chip into that question before we move on to the next one, if you can. If there is no answer, then I'll take it as a no. So actually not too many climate change experts coming up at this moment. Quite a lot of people with medium skill levels, that's fine. Nobody in this group is completely ignorant of climate change. Well, I think that shows, yeah, this is a self-selected group actually, not a random sample. Okay, we can live with that. I'll show you the results in a minute. Just to move on to the next question, this is more open-ended. What do you think are the likely effects of climate change in India? And if you refresh your phone, this should now be on the screen. Go to slide. Yeah. Short answers are recommended. No dissertations right now, thanks. So I'll leave that one to run for a few minutes. If you can type in, your best advice there. And well, the IGCS team will, I think, fill you in with more detail as we go along. But your advice also, I'm sure there are many experts in the room here, and we'd like to hear from you on that. So just to move along, social dynamics. Well, again, we can start to trace the relationships. And again, this is from the European project. And you see, oh, here's the city on the left-hand side. Here's a rural. Here's this peri-urban place in the middle. There's a lot of flows of migration and, exchange and interest from both sides and so on and so on. Again, rather a long story. So I'm only just kind of making a little summary here. And we can also contrast this with employment and economic dynamics in the peri-urban. The picture is slightly different, as you can see, but what we do find is, oh, the peri-urban now comes into its own. It's a new kind of city, basically, of shopping malls, enclaves, airport terminals, and so on and so on. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. There are low-income people living there also. In fact, we need them to, do the gardens and drive the taxis, etc. But, they tend to get pushed around, bypassed. Life is not always great. So again, these questions come up on social justice, equity, and so on, which we have to build in. And it's more challenging because the peri-urban is usually fragmented in its governance. It's split in between different areas. They don't have a joint responsibility. I'm hoping the new arrangements in Chennai, for example, can overcome some of this. But then, of course, the arguments all then take place behind closed doors much of the time. So the story is not over yet. Anyway, so just to run past you, well, we have visions of places where people live. This is a urban neighborhood where everyone is a stranger. There's a supermarket with super parking, and actually it's very difficult to cross the road. And children are not safe, and so on. This is a nightmare kind of city. And then we contrast with a synergistic kind of city where everyone is welcome. The supermarket is now a local market. The houses are mixed and variable, variegated. There are trees everywhere, and so on and so on. So all of this is kind of, standard sustainable city advice. Okay, and then we say, okay, let's analyze. What are these spaces? How do they connect? So here's the spaces of the strangers on the left-hand side, and here are the spaces of connections on the right-hand side. And then below are the pathways which we can map and then travel in order to make the transformation from one side to the other. Now in the peri-urban, this is all more difficult for much of the time because things are spread out. It's very easy for the rich to live in an enclave here where it's very nice, security fence, green grass with a lot of water and so on. The poor are somewhere else. You can drive past them and so on. It's actually more of a challenge to do this in the peri-urban, but I can't see any alternative. We have to try somehow. So a couple of questions on that. Well, who is the most vulnerable to the peri-urban, to climate change in the peri-urban? And this is a kind of bar chart, which, well, you'll see when you get it on your phone. It's pretty simple. If there are any billionaires in the audience, please, put your hand up. We'd love to hear from you, because we also have to contrast the experience with, the migrant workers, farmers, etc., etc. So that is, well, let's see, well, we'll wait for the results to come in a minute. I think I'll get to the end of my stuff and then show the slides all in one go. That's probably more efficient. There's another question coming up, which is more open-ended. Let's say, we'll just switch to that one rapidly now. This is open-ended. So your best advice is requested for this question, and I'll leave that hanging for a few minutes. While we talk about government and governance, finally, here we have some political scenarios. And these are not only scenarios, these are political programs. Now, I'm not going to start a political speech, but we can see this kind of playing out in different countries around the world. The business elite in countries such as ours in the UK says, oh, let's take back control and make our country great again. And because they control the media and, other things, they manage to convince people, and the fact that they are really working for international finance, well, this is, not so easy to see. And then we can track around those different quadrants to say, these are not just scenarios for some distant future. These are happening on every street corner, every day, all around us. So that's just kind of to say, yeah, this is where we are at. And then we have to say, okay, how does this governance thing work? Again, we divide into two parts. On the left, we have a load of problems. Local government cannot cope. On the right, here we have a different kind of picture of synergies. And the effect on the ground is, yeah, this is what we need to create or to grow and to regenerate, a sustainable synergistic city region with its peri-urban and everything. So a little bit more analysis. Here is a top-down government, all a bit disconnected. At the national level, the local level, even more disconnected. The stakeholders have no way of proper communication and coordination. The citizens are out of the loop, so to say. The system as a whole, if anyone does systems analysis here, it's incredibly weak. The channels for feedback are really low. Well, every 3 or 4 or 5 years, you get to put a cross on an election ballot paper. That's about it. This is not great, for a system in the modern world. So again, we say, okay, on the right-hand side, how could this be done better? And there are some principles which seem really important. And here we talk about co-governance, collaborative governance, which is not to say that, oh, suddenly you can just take away all the power structures and inbuilt institutions. It's rather more like a way of working over a period of time. And you say, okay, let's start this in motion. And over time, we will discover solutions which benefit more people for more of the time, not just, the winner takes all, as on the left-hand side. So that, again, work in progress. Well, finally, the question of resilience. I think we've really covered this now, but you can get a picture of, here's the river, could be coming down from the Western Ghats maybe, or something. And everything's going wrong. The land management is not connected to the house building program, and the government is all in silos. They can't talk to each other, and so on. On the right, we have a different kind of situation. The government is all connected. The engineers have social skills. The sociologists have engineering skills, even better. Integrated catchment management, so-called, is practiced by all with agroecology and so on and so on. So that, again, it's a cartoon version, but when we can then take that as a kind of set of signs and signals for how people can all start talking to each other. Well, a couple of final questions, and this is an easy one, which is the best way for the government to manage climate change? And this is like a textbook question in Sustainability 101, just to refresh our minds and so on. A couple of minutes on that, and then, sorry, press the wrong button. The only problem with this system, if anyone uses it, is it's quite easy to press the wrong button and then you lose yourself. Okay, so we're on this one. Which are the best ways for government to manage the climate change in Periurban? I'll just leave that there while we have a look at what's next and come back to one final question. Well, I've studied recently this deeper crisis multiplier. The COVID thing brought all this up to the surface. So, okay, the world is already in a hell of a mess. Racial conflict, migration, displacement, climate chaos, financial inequality, and so on and so on. And then you throw in the COVID, the master game player in the shroud, as you can see. So maybe there is also a positive version. How do we multiply up the synergies? Well, we could write a book about that. But one thing which seems rather important is the virus is in the minds of the people. It's not only out there as a little thing, it's in the structures of society. And this is not comfortable to talk about, but it seems this is where we're at. So we have to talk about it. Well, again, long story. And I'll just, this is very brief now, but just to say, okay, so we did some futures work on the deeper COVID-city, so-called, and the pandemic might be solved. At the moment, no prospect yet. So the pandemic might go on. And in that case, will society make a transition to a better, more human scale society, or will we revert? And on the bottom right, you can see, the situation in many countries where the crisis is then a trigger for other kinds of power games or power grabs, even disaster capitalism, and so on and so on. Now, this is not to say that any of these is more probable than any other, but it is to say, okay, I think we have a problem here, and let's, face the problem rather than run away. Then we can talk about the structure of cities. Cities are already in pieces, but here we talk about high value, high safety, low value, high safety, high value, low safety, low value, low safety. It came to light in our country that actually the cases are very much concentrated in low income areas with poor housing conditions, with people doing manual work, and so on. So then what's to be done? And the point is to say, this is really bad because now there's all this, social division and distrust and intolerance. It's getting worse every day, actually, here. So we have to understand the dynamics here, and then maybe we can find ways through the challenge. This is the line of thinking, at least. And then we say, okay, what is the effect on the peri-urban? And we can now talk about disturbanism, social not work, Zoomiversities, that's my place on the left, Manchester University, and Amazonia, which is the new global economic zone, and so on and so on. Well, there's more detail here to follow up, and there's a couple of more pictures, but I think for the interest of time, I will draw a line just to revisit the final question, if I may, which is, what other ways can we suggest to manage the peri-urban expansion? And this is a free text question, which I'll leave running. If you have any great ideas, we will, well, they're all on the system, and then, as I said, we'll report back. And I think that can carry on while we present. Now, so Christoph and Lalit, that's be done, but would you like to just have a quick glance at the results of the questions?
I think
Yes.
so let us do it right away. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Sure. Pleasure.
That was a very dense presentation. I love your visuals. I think this is really such a rich and very deep way of explaining and presenting these very complex topics.
Yeah.
I was also left with one question. Could you tell us, maybe in very brief and very a few words, your actual experience of a synergistic process? Have you, what is your experience in interacting with stakeholders along these lines? I'm thinking of the challenges. I'm thinking about bringing multiple disciplines together, about the egoisms people have, the power relationships, you know, all these things that come up when you bring diverse and multiple people with various backgrounds together. This whole question also of what kind of knowledge and the types of knowledge do we actually accept in the process? Local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, lay people's knowledge, experts' knowledge, and how do we integrate these? I mean, there are huge amount of questions. Maybe in a nutshell, a brief comment on this would be probably very interesting for the audience.
Yes, well, brief comment. We find that visual thinking is a good way to go around this. It's not going to find the answer in half an hour, usually. I was thinking of a workshop we did in Chennai at your offices about a year ago, maybe. And so with stakeholders from various places around the region. And we say, okay, let's, you know, draw a map of this place, not a physical geographical map, but a map of the people. How do they relate? How do they communicate? Or where there is conflict and power, let's try to draw that. It sometimes helps if people are playing the role which is different to their role in real life. And so in that case, I think I remember, you know, around my table, we had some beggars, we had a billionaire, we had a gangster. I believe Professor Chelarajan, he was playing the role of the gangster, if I remember that, because well, they are stakeholders, we have to talk to them somehow. And farmers and taxi drivers and residents and ecologists. And then somebody said, oh, let's have some non-human actors. So we had some monkeys and a river. Now, all of that can be, you know, drawn, and it's actually great fun. In answer to your question, the first and best way forward is if you find some way for people to have fun, then stuff can happen. People will come out of their box. Many of my colleagues do this in the futures sense. They organize scenarios and futures workshops, this kind of thing. That can also be great fun, although it's also very serious. So that's a very short answer, I think.
Thank you, thank you. Maybe we can have a brief look at the outcome of your survey.
Yeah, just trying to get these slides to roll. It's got a bit stuck somewhere. Okay. Can you see this? Yeah, so, well, here you see a lot of words come up, and I would like to look at these more closely. And next, who works on plays where? We should compare this to the lives and plays where profile. Actually, we did get a lot of response here. No, maybe not enough time, never mind. We asked people for their top priorities for discussion today. This is very interesting. Let's try to look at this, you know, in time within the next hour as the discussion moves on. Okay, so I'll come back to that. Then we said, okay, how much do you or your organization know about climate change? Quite a lot of people advanced, quite a few medium, few beginners, few experts, okay? Good distribution. What do you think are the likely effects of climate change in India? I'll just pick one or two at random. Fascism, oh my God. Urbanization and ignorance of stakeholders. Actually, I never thought of that one. and so on. So that there's more that are not fitting on the screen, but you get the idea. Who is the most vulnerable? Yeah, migrant workers and farmers, construction workers. None of the billionaires are vulnerable. Right? Well, that's okay. That's an interesting result. And what could be done to increase social resilience? Some interesting things coming up here. Agroecology keeps coming up, organizational capacity, etc. What are the best ways for government to manage the climate change in the peri-urban? Local community development is a clear winner here. So in contrast to planning, tax and subsidy gets 0 marks. Well, we could talk about that. And regulation is also not very popular. So that's food for thought there. If there's any planners in the audience, come forth now. But if there are local community developers, well, you've got a career ahead of you. This is great. What is the best way to manage peri-urban expansion? Well, long list. I'll just pick one at random. Planned town planning schemes using land pooling. I think I would want to know more about that. That sounds very interesting. And so on. And then finally, I think, what are the best and worst outcomes? We will have to examine that one in some detail. I'm not sure if that one worked. It's a bit more of a complex thing. It maybe takes a bit more time to explain. What can you suggest for the pathways from worst to best? This one didn't seem to get started, actually.
Yeah. I can't remember having seen this.
Okay. Yeah, maybe in haste we just skipped over. Anyway, so that's the questions from my stuff. Very entertaining, very interesting. So let me now hand over to the team.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe, again. We have a few questions also in the chat. I would like to use these or return to these later in our overall discussion. And make use now to move on to the IGCS team. And I have the pleasure to invite Professor Surya Chelarajan now to speak about the presentation about the Chennai case study and the activities of the Periurban in Chennai, multidimensional and multiscalar analysis of peri-urban spaces in Chennai. And also Uttra Radhakrishnan, and I'm not sure if Avilash is with us today because he has faced, I think, connection problems. But we will move on now with this presentation, and we also continue with the interactive questioning, and we'll then have a final discussion in the last 15-20 minutes. So Chela, the floor is yours, and thank you that you made it on time.
Thank you, Christoph. Uttra is sharing the screen. I don't have control over the screen.
Okay.
Have the
Your screen is sharing already, Uttra, but it seems to be your laptop, the desktop.
Yeah, just choose the folder, whatever. Yeah, and now just make it presentation mode.
Yeah.
Full screen, yeah, into full screen.
Slideshow. I think it will be slideshow, no? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Christoph and Lalit, for organizing this series, and thanks to Joe for sort of setting the stage on this. What we wanted to talk about really is an initiative, and we have lots of logos on the right side of your screen. The top is the Peri-cene project. It's a collaborative project with Joe's team from University of Manchester. The second logo is for the Indo-German Center for Sustainability, which is the umbrella organization under which we came together, and which is supported Christoph in IIT Madras. And the third logo is, of course, the IIT Madras logo, and then the fourth one is that of the Peri-urban initiative, and that's really a loose network of working on this question of the peri-urban. And we started off with two teams, one in Chennai and one in Bangalore. And now through the Peri-cene, we potentially have opened it up to a much larger group of researchers. So the next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah, so the big question really is how do we define this thing that we're calling the peri-urban? And we went through a lot of discussion trying to understand what we mean by the peri-urban. We weren't, of course, the first ones to do this. Joe's group has been working on it for a longer time. And there are several other groups around the world, research groups who've been talking about the peri-urban. And really, it's a phenomenon that has to do with what's happening outside the core areas of cities. And so more recently, people have started to question the very boundaryness or the very category of the city. And they're starting to talk about urbanization as a process. And if you look at the long history of the changes to the planetary landscape, what you end up seeing is something quite a bit more dramatic since the 1500s. With the beginning of the enclosures in England, you start to see, and not just in England, but everywhere else, you start to see settled agriculture and pasture really transforming the planetary landscape. And so this transformation has been going on and intensifying, especially from the 1500s. And if you look at people like James C. Scott, he says settled agriculture from 10,000 years ago is really the birth of urbanization, and led to a transformation through governance of societies around the world. And so it's apt that we should be really talking about collaborative governance in this project. So we'll come to that in subsequent slides. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah. So this question of the what is urban is itself in doubt, because if you use standard definitions of towns, like the census town, you see a certain picture. But then if you start to think about this more in terms of agglomerations of settlements, then you see the kind of picture that you have on the right. So Eric Dennis and his colleagues have been arguing for quite a while that if you forget about the census definition, then we may be much more urbanized than we used to imagine we were. And of course, urbanization processes are taking place at different rates throughout the country. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then the kind of questions that Joe has been asking, what drives what, how do we represent these processes? And this obviously is multi-scale, cross-sectoral, and socio-technical systems, socio-spatial technical systems, one might say, generating all these emergent phenomena. So there are endogenous and exogenous processes, and you have to take into account the kinds of social and global forces, and including material forces like climate change that are transforming the landscape and the relationships in between. So when we start to say that we're looking at exploring the peri-urban, we really have to draw on multiple disciplines, not just urban geography, but a whole range of other spatial and social methods of exploration. Next slide. Next slide, please.
So I have a message from Joe that the next question is now available. Should we switch to the question now? Or would Utra give the signal for that?
No need to skip ahead, but just to say the system has now produced the next question. Maybe I pressed a button or something. So it is there. If anyone has just joined, those are the details, the site and the passcode. For people in the meeting, they might like to consider the question while Chela continues. So for information only. Okay.
Okay.
Is this the same question that you had at the beginning, Joe, or is this a new one?
It might be a kind of reframing, restating of a similar question. You know, the issues are not so simple. You know, maybe we need more than one question to really explore. Yeah.
So when we started our work in the Periurban initiative, in and around Chennai, we decided to focus on the taluk of Sri Perumbudur, and the Bangalore team decided to focus on Doddabellapur. Sri Perumbudur is a taluk. It's well known for its Ramanujar temple and more recently for the industrial zones, the SIPCOTs in the region. And also somewhat infamously for Rajiv Gandhi's assassination. So we decided to sort of zoom in on one taluk and try and understand, using a multiple set of techniques, methods, to try and understand what processes can we observe in Sri Perumbudur. Next slide. Within Sri Perumbudur Taluk, we decided that we should think about land, water, ecology, industrial processes, and a set of social phenomena, because we tried to start thinking about governance as a starting point, and we realized that that wasn't the right way to think about governance. That governance has to be contextualized. It has to be, it has to be place specific. It has to be problem specific, and so on. So we decided, well, let's think about water bodies, for instance. Let's try and understand what are the kinds of governance systems that are associated with water bodies. And Manimangalam was one of these cases. Manimangalam is the name of a tank, but also a tank system. So as many of you would know, in peninsular India, water bodies have been constructed well over the last 500 to possibly 1,000 years in order to try and store the sort of the limited rainfall, incoming rainfall in these tank systems, in these cascading tank systems for agriculture and a host of other local uses. A lot of these tanks used to be used for drinking water supply, and then some of the larger ones were used for irrigation, and many of the smaller ponds, the connected ponds, continue to be used for fishing and other kinds of uses. Right? There are also methods of flood control during extreme events, as it turns out. Right? So the next slide, please. So trying to understand that the tank systems was one of the activities, and Uttara is going to talk a lot more about the water bodies. Another set of let me sort of back up a bit, because I forgot to mention this in relation to Sri Perumbudur. We decided that in doing these apologies. So while trying to understand the peri-urban, we can't just look at one scale. We can't just, pretend that we're on a satellite or on a drone, 30,000 feet above the ground and trying to get a picture of what's happening in these parts. We felt that we had to sort of think about multi-scale ways of investigation. So one of the sites we decided to focus on was this area called Kachipatta, which is kind of 3 wards outside of the town of Sri Perumbudur. And we decided on this area because one of our partners from the Rajiv Gandhi National Institute for Youth Development was already working with kids in this area. And we have begun with Dr. Lalita Subramaniam's help, trying to develop various activities with youth, one of them being this community garden initiative. And again, we can give you more details subsequently, maybe during discussion if you like. Next slide. So now if you think about what's sort of driving peri-urbanization in Chennai, it's useful to look at the timeline of development of the Chennai city region itself. So Chennai, of course, is about a 400-year-old city, and it didn't exist as a city, as an urban region in pre-colonial period. So it is basically defined through the colonial experience. It sort of became urbanized through the colonial experience, and so its plan and layout was in large ways sort of defined by that. But its economic and spatial expansion really took place only in the last 3 decades, and especially the period from 2000 onwards in the post-liberalization area, you see this explosion of the urban expanse of Chennai. Next one, please. So here you see an image of early Chennai in the colonial period. You really only have Fort St. George, Mount Road, and very large water bodies like the Nungambakkam tank. And then you see this kind of development until 1971. Next slide. And between 1988 and 2014, you have this red area, the built-up area, dramatically expanding across the landscape. And correspondingly, many of the water bodies in the region also either shrinking or getting blocked, or their drainage channels getting built over. Right? So if you start to look for the Nungambakkam tank here, you won't find it because there's way too much built up area there. And the same is true of many of the other water bodies within the Chennai region. Next slide, please. So I'm going to actually stop here and have Uttara continue, because this expansion, this trajectory has a story connected to the water bodies, and she's going to try and explain how that connection gets expressed. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. So these are actually a set of maps that our colleague Ram has created, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it to the presentation today, but what we're seeing in the map here essentially is the change of land use from 1988 to 2014. And as you can see, the red spot obviously is the built-up area increasing. But what is not actually visible on the left-hand side, but you can see on the right-hand side in the bar graph, is the water bodies, fluctuating over time. And this is partly because as the city is expanding, there are not that many water bodies in the city itself, but the water bodies have decreased over time, but also what we see over here is this function of seasonality to these water bodies, which essentially dry up in the summer periods and then swell with the monsoons. And so you see how, you know, the change in the water bodies is then reflected in the increase in the barren lands. So in the last few slides, what we saw was, you know, different boundaries of Chennai. So there was the Chennai Corporation, which was about 426 square kilometers, that is now expanded to the Chennai Metropolitan, the CMDA boundary, which is the pink line that you see, which is not sort of fuzzy. And the red line in between is the Chennai Corporation boundary. But what is important in this slide is essentially, you know, where Chennai is headed. There is a plan now where they would like to expand the city from 1,100 square kilometers to the boundary encompassing 3 districts, which then makes the city 8 times its size. And so that then encompasses a much larger area made up of towns, small villages, and multiple ecologies. And in terms of when we're thinking about water, you know, the CMDA boundary only covers about 700 water bodies, and this much larger area over here, the 8,800 square kilometers, basically encompasses around 8,000 water bodies. So we're talking a much larger lot of water bodies. So this image here actually points to the how the city has grown, and this sort of corridor effect that we see over here, that essentially the city has grown along these different corridors. In the south, along the old Mahabalipuram road, which is the scenic driveway that takes you know, us to Pondicherry, along the Trichy highway, the Bangalore highway. So essentially the city has grown along these different corridors. And what has driven, you know, this kind of a corridor effect is, you know, it's not something that's actually taking place organically, but is a planned effect. So the Chennai second master plan actually identifies 5 major growth corridors, and you can see them marked out over here: the South IT corridor, West corridor, Western corridor, and the North. Again, it's not visible what these different entities are, but essentially a series of special economic zones were set up. And one such special economic zone is a site that we worked on in as we were starting our work in the Periurban that Chella had referred to earlier, which is in Sri Perumbudur, that's here. And so there are multiple industries, which has then led to housing growth along these corridors. So we've seen the mushrooming of gated communities, of educational institutions, because land is not available within the city, and yeah, get a sense of how the peri-urban is taking shape essentially. So this is a map that Ram has produced, and is actually part of our Peri-cene project now, where essentially what we've done is try to find these different types of zones, different peri-urban zones that have been shaped by this corridor effect essentially. So so for example, zone 1, which is the IT corridor here on the pink shade, is different from zone 3, which is, for example, more industrialized. Whereas the IT corridor is made up of mostly the IT sector, the electronic sector, has upper class residents, resorts, the entertainment industry. So it has a different flavor and functionality to, for example, zone 2 here, which is mostly made up of the SIPCOT, the special economic zones, educational institutions, and a different set of dynamics at play. And this this is what we've actually tried to summarize in what, I don't know if the text over here is clear, but what Joe had referred to in his presentation, which is looking at these different types of peri-urban zones and understanding, their geographies, the climate risk, what types of vulnerabilities do these regions or zones face, and the governance aspects, and finally, by the end of the project, to be able to create synergistic pathways, essentially. What kinds of scenarios or pathways can we see for each of these different zones? Okay, so here we come back now to this question of, I think what Chella touched on earlier, which is this sort of close link between urbanization in Chennai, land use changes, and the impact that it has had on its water bodies. So we've seen that as Chennai has urbanized, 265,000 residents added per year in the last 20 years. And as this urbanization has taken place, we've seen wetland cover, for example, the Pallikaranai wetlands have significantly reduced from 80% to 15%. And this then played a major role in the 2015 floods as well. And I'll come to that in a bit. So this shows the larger catchment area of Chennai. There are 4 rivers that drain through the city of Chennai: Palar, Kosis Talyar, Adyar, and Kovam. And what we see over here, these are all the water bodies. Like I said earlier, there are thousands of water bodies, and all these minute dots here are the water bodies, and they're cascading water bodies, which means they're actually connected to each other. So there's a stream or channel that connects one stream to the next, and so on and so forth. So I'll lead you through a little bit of this understanding of these water bodies and the dynamics between land use change and water. And we look at 2 specific sites. The first one is Manimangalam, which is about 40 kilometers west of Chennai. And the second one, which we'll briefly look at, is Muthukadu, which is in the southern part of Chennai, which is very close to the coast and hence has a different dynamic. So Manimangalam is one of the thousands of water bodies which are called AREs, and AREs are essentially were built primarily for irrigation purposes, and so they have a special shape, which is essentially a bund is built at the lowest part of a particular area where water is caught. And then through gravity mechanism, that water is then released into the fields, downward from that area. And as Chella mentioned earlier, the reason why these water bodies were set up is because of the absence of perennial rivers and the fact that we have fluctuating monsoons. And so essentially in the monsoons, these areas fill up and then provide water for the rest of the year. So areas were traditionally managed by communities. So typically in this region, you would see that for each village, there will be an area, and they range from, in different sizes. They range from few hectares to hundreds, sometimes thousands of hectares. And many of them date back to 500, sometimes 1,000 years ago. And what has changed, again, in sort of that initial graph that we saw, is how these water bodies have been managed. And I think as we've gone into the post-colonial period, and with the setting up of parastatal agencies, currently the areas are managed by the Public Works Department, at least most of the big water bodies. And the focus has been specifically on the hardware itself, which is looking at the infrastructure of the area itself. So most of the investment has gone into, for example, strengthening the bund, which you see here on the top left picture. So that's what holds the water. And And here on the bottom left picture, what you see is a sluice. So where they release the water into the fields. So this is meant that, the communal aspect or the link that communities and, people living close to these areas who had a direct role to play in the management of these water bodies has sort of eroded over time. And what we're seeing here is Manimangalam here in the center, of course, but then you get a sense of these cascading water tanks and the fact that they all form a system where they link to one another. And the green areas here that we see are essentially, what used to be fields that they irrigated and are still fields. But the dashed green lines that we're seeing is, where we're seeing real estate development. So essentially that becomes the urbanizing eye cut. So this is the first pressure on the water body, which is we're seeing this changing dynamic in the landscape around the water body. And over here we see, for example, there's not just changes happening in the Ayakat itself, which is where the fields used to be, but in the catchment area of the water body as well. So because of this, the seasonality of the water body, when these water bodies dry up, we essentially see people, the soft edge of the water body, which is basically the catchment area, where people slowly begin to encroach upon these water bodies. And this shows, a nice contrast between sort of the rural, how an area used to look. So the soft edge, which is the catchment area, and then that's the bund, and then basic external pressures from all sides. And now this map actually brings us to a third functionality of these water bodies, if you will, which is the fact that today they are seen primarily as sources of drinking water. Because as we can see here in this map, wherever we see these water bodies, we can see the moisture content is closely linked to the water body. So the metro water and private water tanks in Chennai have dug thousands of bore wells around these areas that then supply water to the residents of the city of Chennai, which is essentially set up a conflict between those that still use this water for irrigation, the local farmers, which are now a dwindling number, and increasingly these areas being used as resources for drinking water. So from there we jump to the second landscape, which is Muttukadu. Now this is in some senses similar in that I don't know if it's very visible here, but on the left-hand side here again we see the areas, and the western ridge actually has a whole system of areas, but this being a region that's closer to the city center itself, and this is where the prime IT sector and the real estate is, has a very different landscape from that of Manimangalam. And we had worked on a project called Water is Leverage, where essentially we were trying to understand if it's possible for us to look at this landscape over here, which is basically, this is the coast, the Bay of Bengal, and the Buckingham Canal, which drains into the Bay of Bengal here, which creates sort of the lagoons in the backwaters. And we have multiple ecologies at play over here, essentially. And so also opening it up to different sorts of vulnerabilities, sea level rise and storm surge from the coastal front. This was one of the OMR, which is the old Mahabalipuram Road, was one of the most impacted in the 2015 floods. And most of Sipcot, which is a special economic zone located over here, was completely inundated during the floods. And so the question, again, bringing it back to water, was, is it possible for us to design or incorporate water into planning in such a way that, that we have a more holistic approach. And so the image that we see here on the left is what used to be the catchment area of these 4 or 5 areas, which are then connected to 50 other areas upstream. And in 2018, what we're seeing here is essentially that catchment area has been encroached upon. And here now we have the SIPCOT with the headquarters of global multinational companies like TCS and Cognizant and others. Through the project, the Waters Leverage project, what we're seeing on the right is what we had sort of proposed as a blue-green strategy, which is it possible for us to reconnect these different areas, essentially what we understood to be a disintegrated waterscape, and connect it back to the channel and multiple other planning options or design strategies to see if we can reintegrate that whole waterscape essentially. But I think this leads us to questions, around governance. Is it possible for us to have planning that happens or governance that happens at the landscape level? And I think from there, Chella can take over and he'll talk a little bit more about that.
Just a reminder of the time, it's almost 6:20. That we also give some time for discussion. If you can maybe wrap it up in the next 2 to 3 minutes, if that's possible, Chella?
Yeah, I think so, because we have, we're coming to the close of this talk anyway. Could you go to the previous slide, Chotra?
This is just a summary slide, Chella, of water, which I'm skipping for the moment.
Okay, fine. So we'll come back to this in the questions. All right. So the next slide. So one of the reasons we were looking at 3 different scales is that if we start thinking about governance, we really have to think about what is the form and of institutions and the kinds of governance relationships that we want to sort of try and think about. Right? Clearly, we can't be thinking about national level policy affecting a landscape like Muttakkal. Right? That doesn't make sense. And yet, we're constantly confronted with institutions that are, operating at the state level. Multilateral funding coming in for various large projects. So there's a sort of a cookie cutter approach in the ways in which landscape and larger questions are being handled. And so we felt if you want to start thinking about governance in the peri-urban, we ought to be able to think about different scales separately to begin with, and then see how these can all be integrated. Is it possible to integrate across scales in new forms of governance? So starting at the community scale in a place like Kachipatta, we realized that there's already a set of initiatives by community organizations and NGOs to try and mobilize youth, to try and see whether youth can be involved in trying to do something meaningful about water bodies and waste, and see whether that can be integrated with questions of livelihood and so on. But this isn't happening as a standalone NGO project. Right? This won't work as if it were just a single isolated project in one place where some well-meaning organization comes in and does something. If you want to think about this at multiple places at once, we have to create the conditions, at least a template for how you involve actors at multiple levels working together. So here, what we had in mind was to try and integrate this type of activity to the SDG administrative infrastructure that's already there at the state level, but then to also ask the question, how do we think about this collaboratively? Can a small community organization that's built up, a youth club, work with local government, and can these local government partners get some funding from state level organizations that already have plans to implement SDGs? Then what kind of activities do we need to sort of move around? So this table, even though it's hard to understand, is trying to, hard to read, is trying to sort of come to terms with these forms of integration at the community level. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's neighborhood level collaborative governance that we're trying to think about at Kachipattu, but Uttara also showed you a landscape. She showed you Muttukadu, where there's multiple things going on. It's not clear, who's in charge of what. There's a SIPCOT, there's a local panchayats, there's a revenue administration, Commissioner for Revenue Administration, there's the DTCP, the Directorate of Town and Country Planning, there are coastal organizations, etc., etc. So, and then there's also, in some parts, there's a national highway, there's a highway administration. So there's all kinds of governance entities when we think about land, water bodies, and so on, even at a community scale. And it gets more complicated at the landscape scale. And so we're trying to ask the question, how do we think through this in terms of collaborative governance? Is the SPV model, the special purpose vehicle model that's being used for standard projects, worthwhile redesigning, reconstructing, so that it's sensitive to community needs, that you have local representation, that you have deliberative processes, that you think about sustainability and democracy, etc., etc. How do we construct some entities that can think and operate at the landscape level? And then we are also been considering watershed level questions, which we didn't have time to present today, but there, you really have to think about, again, this multi-scale and cross-scale interaction from the community or neighborhood scale all the way to state. In fact, the kind of region we're thinking about crosses 3 state boundaries. So how do we actually integrate governance at all of these levels? Right? So that's really the question that we are trying to address. I'm going to stop over there because these are really questions for the audience, then something that we can provide solutions to. So I think we have a few questions, right, Uttara, around adaptive governance.
I apologize. For some reason, the questions didn't show up on my slides, but I know that they're on Joe's poll, and I'll also post them. I'll paste them on the chat window. So I think it becomes part of the discussion, perhaps.
Yes, we have several comments here as well, especially on water management, integrated water management, also with the focus on local communities managing water bodies and the long history, especially in Tamil Nadu. I would like to take this up because this is probably one of the key dimensions: land use and water management, the usage of water, the dependence on water, and at the same time also climate-related risks like flooding with the urban expansion at the same time, which you also mentioned, Joe, in the Pennine region. Maybe that's an interesting point we could discuss. What are the solutions there? Because the transformation of water bodies and building over that land is also increasing urban flooding in Chennai. So how is this issue dealt with in the context of the UK, which is not only suffering from floods in the Pennine region, but it's across the country almost in many places. this is a big issue of urban expansion or the expansion of villages.
So you're asking me?
Yeah, just to, because in Chennai, this has become one of the core areas we have been looking into and understanding this interdependency on water scarcity and flooding as an increased risk with this peri-urban transformation, with these changes, these dramatic land use changes. And there is this reference to the historical evidence of water bodies that have been human-made and integrated to manage floods as well. So one of the approaches now is to, in a way, rebuild it, at least with the still existing water bodies. So is there something similar, or how is this being managed and dealt with and addressed in the UK context, if you have any experience from your own work?
Sure. So, well, the UK, you know, many people think, oh, the UK is a very civilized, developed place. Everything is, you know, very well managed and so on. Actually, it is not the case. I think I put a little note in the chat line to say, actually, in the UK, all of the big kind of land grabs went on about 200 years ago. Low-income people were pushed off the land to work in the factories, very bad conditions, and then the water system of the country was reorganized to feed those factories. And then when the industrial base of the country moved, in many cases, to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh and so on, large areas of the country were left without much economic purpose. So the ecologists then come in and say, oh, we could, you know, clean this place up, have a beautiful water park, green valley, etc. And that would be good for the flood program as much as anything else. But with our current, you know, climate of deregulation, privatization, etc., the government does not want to force people to, you know, respect these things. So houses are developed on high-risk flood plains. Critical infrastructure is put in the wrong location, and so on and so on. Now that's all on the problem side. So then you say, okay, can we offer any experience on the solution side, ways forward? And well, I wish I could be, you know, really positive, but let's say the UK is learning as much as anybody else in this room. You know, gone are the days when we could parachute around the world telling everybody what to do. It's more or less the other way around now, actually. So what we are trying to evolve is a model of sustainability governance or co-governance or collaborative governance, whatever you call it. I showed a little sketch of this in the slides before. There is obviously much more to explore and to talk about. And in the water case, well, let's say, again, we can try to solve the immediate problem of, you know, the floodwaters are rising. Okay, let's build a wall. And then we find, oh, the water just then goes down the river to some other place. And now we find, oh, if we protect the big cities, which is, you know, have a lot of infrastructure, then the water flows down into the peri-urban area. And that's a bit tough for the peri-urban people and the farmers and so on. So in other words, integrated solutions are called for. In order to do that, we have to reach towards integrated forms of government or governance in which all of these different interests can be balanced. We look for the synergies, not just to tell people what to do. We look for the synergies, and this is not just some abstract thing with a flip chart. It gets, you know, to talk about real money, real power, real land use control, and so on and so on. But all the time overhanging the thing, there are these structural changes and transformations. I mentioned in my little sketch on the hills, the Pennine region, which is north of Manchester. There are huge open questions. What is the future of this place? The agriculture is not really viable. The hills are falling to pieces with, you know, the wrong kind of management. The wrong kind of people own the land on the top of the hill so that the water just runs down. It's not their problem. Who can actually tell anybody what to do in this situation? Everything is up for grabs. So again, we have to then say, okay, let's, you know, the challenges are so big, we cannot refer to the textbook, or there is no policy which will really be strong enough to organize anything. So again, let's see what we can do, you know, between the people in this area. We have a very interesting experiment in motion. It's an organization called Pennine Prospects. I'll put the link on the chat if anyone wants to follow it up. So that's the short answer.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm also looking at the comments here, and one emphasis that we have been discussing is this collaborative effort, doing things together, creating also a commonality and a common approach. And someone mentioned here the Perurban system, and this brings up the question of the commons. How can we use this concept of managing valuable resources, ecological services as a community, and not only through private markets. So that's an interesting point, because this also affords questioning how can we create these processes to coordinate the commons, and also to work towards a common understanding of using them. I see that Chella also responded to this already, because in Tamil Nadu there is this Perurban concept, which is also a fairly old landholding system that has, I think, quite some importance. And the question is, how could this be probably also transferred and maybe brought into the contemporary context of land ownership and water management? Is there any other comment regarding the global commons, maybe from the IGCS team as well?
Christoph, I just wanted to comment on that. I think one of the big issues when we're talking about Perurban or the commons is the tricky legality of it itself. Is the minute we try to understand, you know, the area, for example, even in the records, it's not clear, for example, how large the catchment area actually is. So where does the area begin and end is a question, and that opens up the gray space for fudging of documents, for encroachment, and, you know, related activities.
Yes, yeah. Are there still some results out from the questions?
Yes.
That would be worthwhile to review or comment upon. We are now 5 minutes over time. I'm just conscious of time. Maybe another few questions might come in the meantime, but that we are also able to have a look at these responses.
We didn't have a great response for this set, but just let's have a look. If I share my screen from here.
I was trying to...
can you see this on the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, this was a question on the polycentric model. We could discuss. So polycentric is clearly popular. Okay, I kind of guessed that. And then why is it popular? Well, because local communities have more chance of participation. Yeah, I hope so, but this is, we have to make sure about this. The polycentric model makes each node self-sufficient to an extent with networks of cooperation, but it requires clear definition of ecological boundaries and networks and regulation of the expansion. So, okay, I'm all in favor of this, but I'm worried that reality is more complex. Any views on that from the panel? So for instance, the definition of the ecological boundaries in the hinterland of Chennai, well, we saw the map. And I was so impressed with that beautiful map of water. I thought, wow, this looks like a living, breathing thing, which is, you know, fantastic. But then, okay, so how does this village or that town, you know, define its ecological boundary? Everything is so connected. Any advice on that?
Not really, Joe. I think we're starting to try and interpret on this. So I don't want to sound glib.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
Part of the importance of this question is that a lot of what is official policy is actually in India is actually supporting corridor development, industrial corridors and ribbon development. And one of the issues is when we talk about integration and we talk about the city of short distances, walkability, and a synergistic related model of functions, then a ribbon becomes more complicated and more complex, also to provide infrastructures. And it also cuts through a lot of ecologically sensitive areas. Just think about pathways for wildlife and other aspects, forestry, and so on and so forth. So these are things that make it valuable to deliberate about what kind of spatial model or ideal and vision do people or planners, policymakers, etc., at least try to apply. And at the moment, it seems the dominating model, at least in India, is more of a ribbon or corridor. So why not propose something else? I totally agree with you. The world is much more complex, and a polycentric model has been applied as a vision, especially in Germany, where it also often did not work, to create satellites, to create more independent, smaller towns outside the metro cities and so on. So, but the question is it valuable to strive for another model, and why? What would be the value of it?
Yeah, well, I kind of agree with everything there. My guess is we need to actually do kind of more homework. Speaking as a kind of researcher, thinker myself, I would say that. But to say the textbooks of the 20th century, great ideas, very good intentions, but somehow they don't seem to get it. They don't quite get to the front line of the challenges of reality that we now face. Well, this is where I'm training myself to, do something useful maybe. Let me just try the next slide. Okay. Well, sorry, we didn't get a lot of response here. Who are the main agents driving land use changes? Okay. So I think we needed a bit more time for that. I'm not sure what happened then. Just to comment on the role of real estate. Well, I think in this group, there is a very talented sustainable real estate organizer by the name of Gautam RK, based in Bangalore. And we have discussed over some months how the real estate sector could be brought into this loop. And it seems if this picture is anything to go by, oh, here you are, some more responses. The role of real estate is fundamental. Now, a lot of people say, oh, real estate, they don't care about anything. They just want to make a fast buck, etc., etc. So then we have to look for forces of change. Some of them may be international on the high end of the scale. Investment funds, well, now they look for green certification and sustainability and CSR and so on. On the other ends of the scale, there may be other forces, other pressures, or other opportunities. I myself, for example, involved with a large-scale inner urban real estate scheme in London, which is setting up a non-profit community land trust, which then proposes to develop more sustainable units, which are more available to low-income people than is otherwise the case. So these examples, they will filter through somewhere and somehow. So this picture for me illustrates the importance of the real estate. Let's see if there's anything on the final slide. Oops. Okay. I'm not sure why we didn't. Yeah, anyway, maybe the questions were not flagged up enough. How could land use zoning be more adaptive and responsive? Well, for me, this tries to sum it up. Yeah, we build in the ecological system into the land use zoning scheme. And by the way, we need to build in the social system and the cultural system and the technology system. So land use zoning is not just about land use, it's about the spatial organization of everything. So that's the challenge, if there are any land use planners in this meeting today.
Yeah, I think that's crucial here to pick up on this fuzziness and the boundaries that keep shifting and changing, also due to seasonality of water bodies, for example. So this is a very interesting question, confronting a relatively rigid system of fixed land uses that we normally apply in land use zoning and land use management. But yeah, probably that's one of those questions that we need to resolve in the years to come.
Yep.
Okay.
Final slide. This is coming back to the beginning. What are the top priorities for discussion today? Sorry, we should have reviewed this, systematically an hour ago, actually. But I think, we're covering a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
Somehow or other. And well, my big hope is that we can make real progress and move forward, not just, recirculate the same issues around in circles. For me, this discussion has been very useful. I'm hoping it will continue, another day.
Yes, that's what we are planning to do. And without further summarizing and concluding our session here, I would like to thank you all very much for your time and for your presentations and the inspirational discussions that we had here, including also this trial of interaction with these questions. I think it's a very good method. Probably we need to have an even better time management with this. It needs some time to give to people to provide the time to answer these questions. But next week we will have our next and final session so far in this webinar series. And with this, I would like to hand over to Lalit to give you some idea of what we are up to in a week's time.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, Joe, Sheila, and Uttara. Very, very insightful. Very, very amazing. I mean, I always find the process of planning as how to, we try to simplify the understanding of a rather very complex phenomenon. And the more we try to approach and comprehend it again and again, it's highlighted how the system is quite complex and very dynamic. So what level of effort is required? So one more thing parallelly I noticed from today's presentation, particularly by IGCS team, is as if water is essentially an integrating element and governance is the glue which keeps things together. Governance in any form, whether around water, living conditions, requirements. So that again came out as a very strong element and perhaps one of the way forward. The process of urbanization in India, the kind of factors and elements it faces are very different, of course, from UK and other part of the world. But at the same time, there are some of these leverages, I think, what we have. for the governance, which is fairly complex though, but perhaps the key also lies there. How can we come together to work out our coexistence? So far, we had a time, or we could afford the possibility of living in isolation in the name of various describable models, but we have reached a point where we need to work out our coexistence. And there something like this again, I remember the example of Auroville, where we have our own challenges, but it is an effort towards that direction. And historically also different civilizations or different areas in the world, they have been making an attempt towards this. But overall, I found today's session very insightful, very good in detail, and it is always good to see and connect with the people of the same fraternity and community working and thinking on the same path. So that is really very enriching and inspiring. Coming back to the last session, which we have next Friday, it has a topic of, let me see if I can just bring the image on the screen here. Not sure. Okay, I can't reach perhaps. So this is what we have is our next session is on regional perspective and practices. We have two academicians, professors, Dr. N. Sridharan from SPA Bhopal, Director SPA Bhopal, and Dr. Aridnam Biswas from IIT Roorkee. They have been working in the field of regional planning, and they would like to share their perspective, knowledge, and experience around this. Then we have something very interesting, Mr. Jacob from Kerala. He's retired as additional chief town planner, and he will be sharing the district planning experience from Kollam, from Kerala. I have heard myself quite a lot about this, very positive things, and Kerala has been also in the forefront of community participation, development, and a larger scale planning, including the technical tools as well as bringing people together. So myself also looking forward to that session. And as we have three presenters, we are hoping we will have a bit more time for everybody to join for discussion, including concluding possibilities for this webinar series. That is it from my side. Thank you very much, everybody, to join, and all three presenters. And Mr. Ravinash, he could not join for some technical, but thank you again for your efforts. This is it from my side.
Yes, thank you very much all.
Thank you very much again.
Hope
Bye-bye.
to see you next week again.
Yeah, please join.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for
Bye-bye.
being with us.